Hey people, so we're gonna have a little talk right now about Copic markers. So, there's a lot of myths and different things going around, and so I want to just give you guys a quick talk about Copic markers and just kind of some ins and outs. So if you happen to have any questions or anything, now is the time to ask me. Or if you're watching the replay, you'll know because this little thing right here that says live, there's no red square. If it's not a red square and it doesn't say live, that means that I'm not live. Oh, hey Sonia, peekaboo. So we're going to have a little talk about Copic markers. So if I'm not live, then what I need you to do is just drop a comment down in the comments here and ask your question. And either myself or Sandy will get back to you. There's a lot of people on here who have a lot of knowledge of Copic markers, but I want to debunk a couple of myths. So don't mind my light, like literally right there in the screen. That's fine. So there's a lot of myths and stuff going around about Copic markers and just all kinds of different things happening. So I see there's 6 people on right now. So if you could say hello, it would be awesome so I know who's here. Hey, Mark, how are you? I haven't seen you on for a while. Okay, so first things first, we're going to talk about ink with Copic markers. First of all, I use Memento. This is a dye ink. The reason you want a dye ink is because a pigment ink will bleed with your Copics. So Copic markers, the blender solution for them, which I have right here, okay? So this is the various ink blender solution. This is what's in your colorless blender. So this right here is exactly what is in this, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about a bunch of stuff. Hey, Tyler. Hi, Ilea. I know you finally caught me live. Becky, what's up? Anne, hello. Hey, Holly. Okay, so you want to use this really cool dye ink. So anything that is a dye ink will work with your Copic markers. Hybrid inks generally don't work so well. They'll end up bleeding. The more you blend on top of them, the more they will bleed. Hey, Diana. So you want to be sure, hi Cherie, you want to be sure to use a dye ink with your Copic markers. You can also use an archival ink with your Copic markers, but archival ink tends to stain your stamps. So if you don't mind if your stamps are stained pink, then an archival ink will actually work for you. There's also another kind of ink. Gina K makes amalgam inks, and these are just little gift inks that my friend Sarah got me. So Gina K makes an amalgam ink. The difference with an amalgam ink is that it kind of plasticizes itself as it dries. So there's kind of a plastic pigment in it, if you will, that hey Lucille, that when this dries, it will kind of make itself into a plastic-ish. So it will dispel your ink, kind of like if you were to emboss with it. If you were to use like a Versamark and embossing powder, that's sort of what an amalgam ink does. Kind of, just to explain it to you if you've never used it. So Gina K does make an amalgam ink. It does work well with Copic markers, but know that even if you stamp in the no lines technique, you're not necessarily going to be able to blend on top of it to make that ink go away because it actually will hold its own pigment. So that's why I use the dye inks, because I can use my Copic marker to dye this ink. Econ 3 also makes a fade out ink, which I have right here. It is a hybrid, but it is a fade out ink. So what that means is that, so even though this might bleed with your Copic markers, you're not going to know because this is kind of like a disappearing ink, if you will. Whatever pigment you put on top of this, it will absorb that pigment and take on that pigment and become that color. So if I stamp this on my piece of paper and then I color it with a pink marker, it's going to turn pink. If I color it with a green marker, it's going to turn green. So this is a cool ink. I will tell you, the pigment of this is uber hard to see. So if you do not have fantastic eyesight or incredible lighting, this is not going to be the ink for you to use. However, if you have great eyesight or good lighting or whatever, or you are an artist and you want to stamp your stamps and be able to kind of manipulate them a little bit to how you want, this is a fantastic ink for you to use. So that's kind of the lowdown on inks as far as stamping goes. So what I'm going to tell you about the colorless blender solution, you kind of have to understand, really, Sonia? You're like quite the colorist. I'm surprised you don't know this. So you kind of have to understand Copic markers to understand, you got to understand like the engineering of them to understand really how to use them. So that's part of why I'm going live today, to explain this stuff for you guys. And I'll also try to save this video and post it on my YouTube so you guys can watch it later as well. There's a huge bunch of myths going around right now about the Copic marker drip or the bleeding or whatever it is. So this is kind of what we're discussing. So this is the various ink. So this is, again, what's in your colorless blender. This is also what you're going to want to use to clean your markers. You want to clean anything that's going to touch the nib of your marker with this. So inside of your caps, you want to clean with this. Your nibs themselves, you want to clean with this. The barrel of the marker, it doesn't matter. You can just use alcohol to dissipate the ink and it's fine. But hey, Linda Lou. But this is the carrier solution for what is in your color markers, okay? So what happens is so like this is R85. And it's actually R85, not 85. So there's a difference here. R is the color family, so it's in the red color family. 8 is the pigment, and 5 is the saturation. So what happens is they've put a level 8 of pigment in here, and they've put a level 5 of saturation in here. So there's 2 different levels that they play with in order to get this color. And essentially, like, you know when you go to the hardware store and they mix paint for you and you watch them like put the little paint into the gallon, all the gallons of paint start as white and then they put a different level of color and saturation and all this different stuff, however much they put in there. So this is your white paint, essentially. It's clear paint. And so this is your carrier solution. So what this marker is they've taken from the R family and put saturation and pigment level of 8 and 5 into this solution and then put it in this marker and labeled it with an R85. So with that being said, that is how the different levels of saturation work. That's why some markers get sticky and gummy. Like if you pull out your R89, it's got a very high saturation and pigment level, meaning there's a lot of pigment and not so much solution. So it starts to get really sticky because this is essentially pure alcohol. It's a little bit different than alcohol. It's not exactly alcohol. It's a little bit different, but this will actually evaporate over time. So when you first fill your marker, great, everything's right because your solution, your color family, your saturation, and your pigment are all happily married together. And hey, Kaylee, hey, Amy, and they're coexisting wonderfully. But then this starts to evaporate over time. Doesn't matter if your caps are on perfectly or not. Eventually, this will evaporate, okay? So what happens is this starts to get sticky because there's so much saturation and pigment in here and not enough of the solution, okay? So if you were to take some of the solution and put it in this marker, would it still have the same saturation and pigment level? Well, hey, Nikki, theoretically it would, but you're adding more of this, so you're going to drown out some of that. So you're going to drop your saturation and pigment levels by adding some of this. Can you rehydrate your marker by adding a little bit of this? Absolutely. But that's not what you want to do because you won't have a true color. So the best thing to do is to clean your nib and add more of the R89, okay? that brings me to, I have to put it back on my little thing or I'll forget where it's at. So that brings me to the core of your marker. Okay, there is a core in this marker. It is not just a plastic barrel. There is actually a foam core in here that is engineered specifically for Copic markers. This is where things start to get sticky. A lot of people will tell you that these markers are pressurized. And a lot of people will tell you there's no way they're pressurized because if I were to open this cap, ink would spray out everywhere. They're both right. And they're both wrong. You don't need a physics degree to understand pressure. If I were to take a regular kitchen sponge and put a whole bunch of water in it, it's only going to hold a certain amount. Shut up, Nikki. It's only going to hold a certain amount of water, right? And then any extra water that you put on top of it is going to leak out because there's too much pressure in the sponge to hold that water. It's not pressure like if I were to open this and ink would squirt out, that would mean there was an introduction of some sort of accelerant. So like a spray paint can or anything like that. So if I were to put the cap on here, it's not pressurized like a airplane cabin. It simply means that there is pressure in the core of this. I have spoken to Copic and they have told me this is true, that there is a certain amount of engineering that goes into this that creates the specific amount of pressure to make it so you can color with this nib. Now, the other half of the school of thought will tell you it's heat, and heat from your hand will heat up the ink and make the ink come out of the marker. Again, true and false. Hey Leah, if there is a whole bunch of pressure in your core, meaning your marker is absolutely full, you will put your hand on the marker to color, right? Well, obviously your body heat is going to heat up the molecules in that ink, meaning they're going to move faster. As those move faster, they're going to expand. As they expand, they need a place to go. There's so much pressure in your core, they can only expand so far. So if they expand so far, what are they going to do? They're going to drip and they're going to leak. So if you take both caps off, some people will tell you do this, some people will tell you don't do this. I'm always going to tell you to do this. If you take both caps off, number one, you're relieving some of the pressure in the core of your marker by allowing it to have air on both ends. That will relieve some of the pressure. Also, you're going to vent some of the heat out of there from your hand. If you're super, super hot-handed, you probably have a lot more leaking issues than people who are have poor circulation and have really cold hands. There are some people who always have super cold hands and they probably never have a leaking problem unless they overfill their marker. Okay? So if you take both caps off of your marker, you're going to not only relieve the pressure by introducing air to both sides of it, but you're also going to vent some of the heat out of the core of your marker by allowing this to have extra air. With that being said, Copic markers are very unique. The reason you can store them vertically instead of horizontally is because there is pressure in that core. And having pressure in that core creates that availability of putting the ink into both ends at the same time. Otherwise, if you stored them vertically, there would always be ink down here and never up here. And have you ever noticed if you store them vertically, you tend to put this gray line at the top, which is your brush nib, and you always pick it up and color, and there's instantly ink down there? It's because there is pressure in the core. So, yes, yours blob all the time and pull off both caps. Correct. And sometimes it's just the marker. Sometimes it has a lot to do with your climate. That's kind of the other school of thought with the whole pressure thing. How come Copic markers work in Colorado, in Denver, the mile-high city, and also in New Orleans, that's at sea level, and they work the same. So, hi Terry, we're doing Copic class here. So the pressure in the marker isn't necessarily like a perfect amount of pressure, it's in the core. So if your markers are really full, Or if your elevation happens to be kind of different and it's kind of creates a trifecta for you. If there's a ton of humidity in your air, you're probably going to have a lot more problem with ink blobs. But my guess is you're probably overfilling your markers. It has more to do with cleaning your nibs than filling your markers per se. So I would definitely look into cleaning my nibs a lot more if you have a lot of blobs, and not necessarily filling your markers every time, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense to you. The other thing that you can do, I mean, honestly, if you really are hot-handed and you have a lot of blobs, is set the marker on an ice pack or a cool rag or something like that prior to coloring, and condense those molecules in that ink, because if those molecules condense and are cold and are moving slower, they're less likely to blob out. So, hey, summer. So if you are hot-handed or you're using your marker a lot and you start getting blobs, 3/4 of the way into your coloring, it's because those molecules have heated up. They're moving faster, they're expanding, they have nowhere else to go, so they're gonna leak out. It's just a thing. You're not gonna always be able to entirely prevent that. It's physics. I hated science growing up. I am not a physics person, but I took the time to understand how this medium works so that I can work with it. Like I told you guys many, many times, I am not an artist, and I used to sit outside the art room and cry. I didn't even want to go in. It was icky and messy in there, and I did not like it. For me, I learned your hands are always warm and hot. It's usually just when they are new. Yeah. So try the ice pack trick. It might actually work for you. I don't know. Excuse me. But I learned how to use this medium and make this medium trick the brain into thinking it's looking at a 3-dimensional object when it's looking at a 2-dimensional object. This is a flat piece of paper. It is 2-dimensional, yet I can make this object look 3-dimensional with shading. This was a very clean thing for me to do, and it was fun for me to learn out. It's still fun for me because I learn all the time to learn how to use this medium to make something like this happen. So, Copic School, this is where we're at. There's different schools of thought on filling your markers. Hey, Terry, again. There's different schools of thought on filling your markers. A lot of people will take off both caps and they will take their ink refill and they will just drip it on the nib. If your marker is starting to get a little sticky or a little dry and you need to finish whatever it is that you're working on, I highly recommend this. It's very easy to do. You can throw a couple of drips on the tip of your marker. Because the core is pressurized, it will pull the ink in because it wants to absorb that so that it can equalize the pressure. So with that being said, adding a couple of drips to the nib of your marker is totally fine. It's an acceptable way of filling your Copic marker. I would not suggest, if your marker starts to get dry and you can see like little white dots on your paper, your marker is really dry, I would not suggest filling it that way. I would suggest getting let me pull them off my little cart here, the Copic tweezers, and removing your nib and filling up your marker this way, okay? So you can fill up your marker just by taking this is various ink, this is my zero colorless blender, and just taking it, I balance it on my fingers and I put a certain number of drips in here. Okay, that's all I do. Then you take your nib, you put your nib back in, make sure it's seated all the way, meaning it's all the way into the marker. It's especially important with your brush nib. Put both caps back on, warm it up so that the molecules marry, commingle, and then you're ready to go. You can color again. Now, you will notice that all of these have, let me put the cap on so I don't spill it everywhere, have a graduated marking on the side here. This is for precision filling. If your marker is really empty, it can hold 2 cc's of liquid. I was going to say alcohol. Whatever. It can hold 2 cc's of liquid. So if you want to be really, really, really technical, you can get a scale. You can weigh your Copic markers. Sketch markers with both caps on should weigh 14 ounces. Sorry, not ounces. That would be a heavy marker. Grams. So you can get these, which I just got from Terry. Terry has all this stuff, by the way. You can get these, and this is a Copic marker refilling needle. And essentially what you do is you take the cap off of this, you put the needle onto this, you take and I mean, this is a legit real needle. This is for reals. You open both ends, you take your nib out. Then by putting this into your marker, you can feel the core. You can feel where that core is. You can invert this and you can look at your graduated points and see exactly where 2 cc's is. So you can squeeze and then bubbles will come up and let it settle, just like that. And so this will precisely fill your marker. Note that when you are done with this needle, it is reusable, but you have to clean it. You have to clean it out. Otherwise, you're going to get a bunch of different colors mixing together, and you don't want that. Obviously, with coloring, with the colorless blender solution, it's not a big deal. I'll just shake out any extra. I usually have Q-tips sitting by here, and I'll use a little Q-tip, and then I will just stick it back in its little case. And now it's ready to be reused again. Just make sure you clean it out if you are using a different color, because obviously that's gonna change things. Now, as far as your nibs go, you only want to use this to clean your nibs. There's a couple of different ways to clean your nibs. First of all, you notice I'm always using the Copic tweezers. You do not ever, ever, ever want to touch your nibs. You have oil on your fingers. It's natural. You're human. At least most of us are. So if you use these, you don't have to worry about touching your nibs because it's not going to be a thing. But never, never, never touch your nibs with your fingers. The oils from your fingers will actually clog up your nib. And you don't want that to happen. So with that being said, use your tweezers and always remember to clean off your tweezers because they will hold ink on them because they have a surface. So they will hold ink on them and the ink will dry. You're laughing at at least most of us are human. So you always want to use the tweezers to pull your nibs out. There's a couple of different ways to clean your nibs. You can clean your nib just by leaving it on your marker. You can take a cotton pad and soak it in this and wipe off your nib. You can either do that with a paper towel or a cotton pad. I actually prefer to do it with like the Via paper towels because they're really thick. They're like cotton, but they don't leave any of the fluff on your nib. Sometimes if you use an actual cotton pad, like a makeup pad, it will leave some fluff on your nib and you don't want to do that. So the Via paper towels are actually a great tool to have with your Copic markers because they don't leave any paper pigment on them and they don't leave any cotton pigment on them. They're kind of like the best of both worlds. So soak it in this, wash off your nib, put your cap back on, and leave your marker for a minute so that it can redistribute the ink into the nib. The other thing you can do is you can take your nib out. You can place it in a little bowl or shot glass. And fill it with the colorless blender solution. What that'll do is it'll completely soak that nib and dissipate any of the color or anything like that. You pull that nib out, then you let it dry. You let it dry absolutely completely. So I recommend 12 to 24 hours to let it actually dry out. And then you replace that nib into your marker. Then the ink that's in your marker will then refill the nib and it will work again. It is new. I don't prefer that method at all. If I'm going to go through that much trouble, I'm just going to replace my nib. In all honesty, I don't have that much time to hang out and let my nibs clean, and I don't have 358 bowls to put little nibs in to let them clean out. So if I'm going to do that, I just replace my nib. So I have the Super Brush nibs. This is the standard nib that comes on your Copic marker. This nib is called a Super Brush nib. Terry, do you have these in stock now? Because I don't know. So the Super Brush nib is what is in your Copic marker. Now you'll notice they have like these little lines in the middle of them here. You want to make sure your nib is all the way seated in your marker, okay? If your nib is partially up, when you put your nib in, it'll kind of lock into place, and then you have to push it a little bit more because it's going to lock here and then it's going to lock just below. So you want to actually push it just a little bit more. And again, always use your tweezers for this. Never, 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 never use your fingers. When you pull your nibs out, you have to be very careful because this is like a foam brush on top of a needle. And so there's actually, hey Sherry, Mama Sherry's in the house. So there is actually like a little needle inside of this that has like a sponge brush over the top of it. So if you break that, if this sponge brush comes off, your nib is broken. It won't work the same anymore. Essentially that little needle inside of it, late March, early April for new nibs. So be careful with your nibs until then. That little needle inside of it is what injects the ink into the sponge and what holds the ink into the core. So, yes, that's what's leaking. It's oversaturating your sponge and dripping the ink. So just FYI, that's what's connected to the core, not this brush. This brush isn't actually connected to the core. So anyways, you have to be really careful when you take this off because if you happen to break that, then that nib is no longer any good at all. There is another type of nib that you can get for your Copic markers. This nib is called, I can't even remember what it's called. It's called Sketch Optional Nib. I think it's called the mini brush. Am I right, Terry? Hi, Yvonne. Nice to see you here. It's all written in Japanese, so I have no idea. But these are, I think, called the mini brush nibs. And so you'll notice it's a little hard brush on top of the same post that is on your normal brush nib, okay? So this little hard nib is kind of like a bullet nib, okay? So it's not a soft brush like this one. This is a soft brush, kind of like a paintbrush. This is a hard bullet nib that is kind of like a Spectrum Noir marker. So if you prefer to color with bullet nibs, those are great to get. Fine brush nib, something like that. I don't know. I wish it said on here. Yep, Sketch Fine Nib. This is not a fine nib. Okay, total misnomer. Not a fine nib at all. This is a bullet nib. And I have it on the bottom of a couple of my markers. I have it on my 100 because I draw lines with this marker. So it's a line nib. It's very, very different than a brush nib. It is exceedingly, it's a bullet nib. It's a hard nib. And so this will, if you are very shaky of hand and you need a little more help, a little less flexibility in the nib, these are great nibs for you to get. Notice that I did not replace my brush nib with it. So my brush nib is here. I replaced the chisel nib with it. And that is important. It needs to go, and look, this one isn't seated. So here, I'll show you how to seat it. Okay, so see, it's gonna be kind of hard. See how it's sticking up a little bit from the cap right here? So what you need to do is grab the nib from the outside and push it in. See how it just went in like a couple of millimeters? Now it's actually seated. So I don't know why this one wasn't seated all the way. Maybe I just didn't do it right. But you need your nib all the way seated. So anyways, the bullet nibs are great for certain things. I use them. I always have a bullet nib on the end of one of my colorless blenders. This one has a chisel tip and this one has a bullet nib. And yes, I have 2 colorless blenders because I always am misplacing one. So I have them hanging out on my desk all the time. Is there any questions? You do have those in stock, some of these nibs. So Terry has a few of these nibs in stock if you need them. Is there any questions? Is there something that you guys need to know or are wanting to know about your Copic markers that I haven't already covered? I feel like I've covered a lot of ground and a lot of information. I hope this helps you guys learn how to use your markers better by understanding how things work. I always understand how to use my markers better. So, or anything, if I know how it works, then I kind of can use it better because I understand how it works and the inner workings of it all. Excuse me as I hiccup. So if you guys have any questions, please shout them out. Go for it. I would love to answer your questions or at least figure it out. I am going to tell you about the multi-liners because I have one sitting here. So the Copic multi-liners are a pigment ink. They are waterproof and they are Copic proof, meaning they're not soluble by water or alcohol. This is a pigment ink entirely. Hey, Linda Lou Who. Thanks, Francis. So you can use the color on top of your Copic markers. You can use the color on top of your Copic markers or to color on your paper or draw a line on your paper and then color over it with your Copic markers. When it says that it is Copic proof or Copic friendly, it means that the ink in this marker cannot be I can't think of my word. Oh my God. Soluble by alcohol. It can't be dissolved, so it won't bleed or spread. It does not matter, Diana, if you store your Copics vertically or horizontally. Copic is the only marker that you can store either vertically or horizontally because of that pressurized core. So yes, Marisol, try leaving and then coming back in, and that should help it. Summer, I feel like my markers have their own personalities. They all color differently. Yes. 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 You will learn as you collect Copic markers that you have 358 children, and they all have different things, different quirks, different ways that they work, different ways that they interact with other markers. The reason being is they each have a different pigment level and a different saturation level. So they're all going to act differently. C8 is not going to act the same as W8. Why? Because it's in the cool color family and not the warm color family. So even though they have that same pigment, because this is a blue base and this is a brown base, it is definitely going to act differently with different markers. So understand that, yes, Summer, you are right. Every single marker has its own personality. You will learn that there are different markers that will react with the nibs differently. I have 4 EO4s. Why? Because when I get angry at one, I throw it, usually, and I pick up another one because they all act differently. I've even marked them different because I know that they are going to act differently. So here's just 2 of them that are handy. This one has the light coffee tape on the cap, and this is my EO4 of the moment. I have been using, you guys will notice in my videos for the last few months, this one that is double marked. Because it has light and dark, I know that this is the 3rd Copic EO4 that I bought, and I know that it acts differently than this one. Why? I don't know. Probably because this one was made 4 years later than this one, and between the different nibs and the different cores and the different materials that were available, even though it's the same marker, it its expiration date is different. I don't know, but they act differently. So I have both of them. And like I said, I have actually 4 of them. Mostly of my skin blends do I have multiples. I have multiples of E04, E11, and E21 especially. And when my E21 really makes me mad, I swap it out for YR00 because it's a very close in pigment color. So the YR00 is actually kind of my knight in shining armor when my E21s are being jerks. So, is there any other questions? Anybody else have any questions? I am here to answer them. If you are watching this and it is not live, if you do not see a red rectangle right here that says live, then you are watching the replay, and feel free to ask a question down in the comments, and I'm more than happy to answer those questions. So again, Copic markers are a little bit finicky, and until you learn how to use those Copic markers, give yourself some space, give yourself some leeway. Don't be so hard on yourself. When you first started kindergarten, you couldn't just pick up a crayon and color. It didn't work that way. There was a learning curve. This is no different. These are very high-end artist tools. And so if you cannot pick up that artist tool and color right away, that's fine. You can't walk into an advanced Spanish class and speak Spanish on the first day. So don't expect to walk into a Copic class and be able to color the first time you pick it up. You have to train yourself to learn how to use this medium. So anyways, you're just now getting comfortable. It took me much longer than a year to get comfortable, Summer. Really, it took me a long time of coloring. Oh, hey, there's my big sister. Hi, Kim. It took me a much longer than a year to get comfortable. Like I said, I had to learn the inner workings of the markers and how it actually worked and kind of the science behind it in order to figure out how to use that marker and how to use it effectively and in different ways. I can't teach you guys different techniques and different ways on how to use these markers if I don't understand them myself. So I have definitely gone very far, lots of lengths to figure out how these markers work specifically. And that's why I came on today. I sort of wanted to debunk some of the myths that you guys are seeing out there. I've seen a lot of people lately say if your Copic teacher says to take both caps off, then they don't know what they're talking about. That's speculation, honestly. Because I have talked to the Copic people and I have talked to people who have engineered Copic markers. I talked to some of them at Creativation and asked them, what is it? Why do these markers leak? What's the difference? How come Spectrum Noir markers don't leak? How come, all of this different thing to figure out the science behind it to make sure that I'm teaching you guys the proper things. So that's the purpose for this class, this little impromptu get together. And like I said, if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to ask me. I'm totally here for you. I don't keep Copic secrets. I am here to teach you guys. I'm here to teach you guys everything that I know and more. So thank you for joining me this morning. I'm going to go reheat my coffee because it is now cold. And I'm going to get to coloring. I have these 2 little fairies here from the March class, and they need backgrounds, right? So you're welcome, Diana. Anytime you have a question, feel free to ask. I am totally here for you guys. So thanks for joining me. Have a wonderful day. It is Thursday. Yes, I have to look at my watch to see what day it is. It is Thursday. So the weekend's coming. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you guys all very soon. Plus, the more you share and the more you tag friends and people, the more I will show up in Facebook for you guys and all of that stuff. So please, please, please share and tag your friends because it really helps out Sweet Sentiment and myself, and it kind of makes me feel the love. So, shameless plug right there. Anyways, thank you guys. Have a wonderful weekend. Toodles!